We're in Genesis chapter 3, beginning to develop that chapter because it is a very, very important chapter. It tells us why sin came into the world, because it is the first record that we have of man directly confronting God with his sinful statements. And it shows us how careful we have to be when we study the Bible. We have to be very careful that we do not make a sentence say something it doesn't really say, or that we put a meaning to it that is contrary to the law of God. Now, the serpent, that of course is Satan, is talking to Adam and Eve. And the woman is talking to the serpent, and she says in verse 2, we may eat of the fruit of the tree of the garden. But of the fruit of the tree which is in the midst of the garden, God has said, ye shall not eat of it, neither shall ye touch it, lest ye die. Now, we looked at this already, and it's a very important verse because it's the transition going from obedience to disobedience. And remember what it says here, that she is saying things that superficially sound like what God has said to her, and yet there's a very important change. She said in verse 3, but of the fruit of the tree which is in the midst of the garden, God has said, ye shall not eat of it. True. That was absolutely true. Neither shall ye touch it, lest ye die. Oh, here we have already a big addition. God hath not said, ye shall not touch it, because he had told her and her husband that they had to care for the trees so that they would be healthy trees. And in so doing, they would touch that tree. And now she is saying he has told her that they could not touch it. We've talked about this before, but this is so important. It's the progress of sin. When we start with sin, at first we hardly know that we are committing a sin. It seems like what we're saying is logical and we don't have to be concerned. But the fact is that if we begin to put a sinful action on something God has said, and even though it may not sound at all sinful, if it is sinful, we will build that deeper into sin. And that's the way sin has developed all through the world ever since sin came into the world. Now we read in verse 4 again of Genesis chapter 3, and the serpent said unto the woman, ye shall not surely die. Now remember that was the point where the serpent is directly contradicting God. God had already set up the whole business of disobedience in the framework that you will die. Now, he is ready to take the big action and tell her, no, that is not what God said. The serpent said in verse 4, ye shall not surely die, for God doth know that in the day ye eat thereof, then your eyes shall be opened, and ye shall be as gods, knowing good and evil. Now, God hadn't said all of this. The serpent is not the spokesman for God, but the serpent, and this is the way evil works, has used this opportunity to become the spokesman, and already he has learned that she is wide open to want to learn more about what's going on if she would eat of that fruit. And so it sounds very innocent when he says, ye shall not surely die, but ye shall be as gods, knowing good and evil. What's so bad about that? and her reasoning powers are dulled. She's not able to make a real choice, and so she begins to listen very carefully to what the serpent is saying God meant or God said. That's the way sin develops. We turn away from a clear listening to the Word of God, and we put our additions on it, our meaning to it, then no time at all we have a different kind of an answer than what God intended. And that's the way sin has entered in the world and multiplied till it won't stop. And so it goes on. And when the woman saw that the tree was good for food, and that it was pleasant to the eyes, and the tree to be desired to make one wise, she took of the fruit thereof. In her mind, she rationalized all the things that the serpent had added to what was the real truth and which was no longer truth, and she liked it. It all made sense. It all fit, that the serpent really knew what he was talking about, when actually he was contradicting God step by step. God had not said to the woman that the tree would make one wise. God had not said that the tree was good for food. God had not said that it was most pleasant to the eyes. It was the way the serpent was explaining it. And this is the way Satan works in our lives. When we fall into sin, we're not looking at that sin normally as a terrible thing. Oh, don't get near that temptation. When someone is tempting you to do something, stay away as far as possible. That's the way it should be. But no, we listen, and we hear, amongst other things, a sentence or a part of a sentence that seems to be possible. Just possible. And so we play with it in our minds a little bit, and it gets more possible, and it seems reasonable. And the next thing we build on that temptation because it seems reasonable, and we're ready to fall into that sin. I'm telling you, people, the only way to live is turn away from any kind of temptation. If it doesn't fit squarely with the Word of God, stay away from it, because you're going to get tempted into sin, and the wages of sin is death. Death. And mankind goes their way rather than God's way. And here we see it as it develops in the lives of our first parents as they fall into sin. And when the woman saw that the tree was good for food, and that it was pleasant to the eyes, and a tree to be desired to make one wise, my, her whole outlook on that tree has changed. There's no question at all that she has heard the serpent speaking correctly, namely that this was a good tree to eat of, and so she lays it all out there to be examined, and everything sounds good. It all sounds great. And that's exactly the way sin is. We don't sin because we are looking at that temptation and seeing it to be more and more awful. We sin because as we look at it, it looks more attractive by the moment, and it gets more attractive, and pretty soon we ask ourselves, what in the world is keeping me from doing that? That there's no harm in it at all. I can't see any harm in it. We go down this path again and again and again. And of course, here in the case that we're reading about, it led to death, and it always will lead to death if we are going our own way rather than God's way. And so she took of the fruit thereof and did eat. And now we can really see the path to death as she reasons this thing out, and in a way that is leading to death. And gave also unto her husband with her, and he did eat. Let me make this note about that. That's the nature of sin. Normally, when we fall into a sin that we think is not sin, we think we've found something that is very valuable, that is very good, that is very secret or whatever. And we go to our closest friend, which is frequently our husband or our wife or a child or the neighbor next door or whoever it may be, and tell them about it because we really want them also to enjoy the goodness of that particular act, because we've looked at it now just as a good act. But secondly, there is a sinister desire in our soul not to be alone if it is sin. We don't think it all out that way, but that's exactly what is happening. We want a companion in sin. And so she got her companion, and he did eat. Now in our next study we're going to go on to verse 7 and see once what happened to them because they disobeyed God.